At 6:15 a.m., the city was still finding its feet. Streetlights bled into a pale dawn, and the bus shelter on Maple and 3rd held the same small island of warmth every morning. A thin blue blanket, a thermos with a dented lid, and a man who folded his hands as if he was closing a book against the cold. Aaliyah knew him by the cadence of his breathing before she could see his face. She knew the way his coat had a permanent salt line at the hem. She knew the particular way he tucked a corner of the blanket up under his chin like a child. She set the paper bag down with the precision of someone who had less room in the world than other people did. The peanut butter sandwich was simple. 2 slices of bread, peanut butter spread to the edges, wax paper wrapped tight so it wouldn't fall apart. The thermos clicked shut. There was a banana tucked under the bag, skipped on most mornings but not today. She tapped the lid with her knuckle, an old private ritual, then tugged the corner of the blanket to see if he stirred. George opened one eye. He smiled, small and immediate, and reached for the sandwich the way a man who had practiced gratitude did. Carefully, as if the thing might be fragile, he took the thermos and blew on the rim before he drank, not because it was hot, but because the motion was a courtesy. He always said, "You need that more than I do," and she always said, "I get up at 4:30, I need you." He laughed a short laugh at that, the kind that broke off into a cough sometimes, and that was how mornings began. Aaliyah's mornings were hand-stitched into the seams of a life that felt perpetually under construction. She worked the front line in a hospital cafeteria from dawn until mid-afternoon, then took an evening shift at a long-term care facility 3 neighborhoods over. Between shifts, she attended nursing classes 2 evenings a week. Rent took the lion's share of everything. There were nights she checked the account and had to slide a couple of bills to next month, like someone nudging dominoes so they wouldn't topple. There were days when the city did not feel like a place with a future and felt more like a ledger. She never told George about the numbers. He didn't need the arithmetic. He needed the sandwich. He also needed the fact that someone remembered him by name. There is a dignity in being remembered that no government form can tally. Mrs. Carter, who supervised the hospital cafeteria, watched this routine with a kind of parental tolerance. She'd been with the hospital long enough to remember when the floors were linoleum and the cafeteria smelled like real coffee. She'd seen Aaliyah at 5:30, hair under a net, eyes still thick with sleep, hands steady as she packed a slip of wax paper into a paper bag. "You could stop," Mrs. Carter had said once, buttering a roll with slow, deliberate care. Aaliyah had shaken her head. "If I don't do it, who will?" Mrs. Carter made a sound that could be praise or a question. "Then take an extra roll on your break," she said, handing Aaliyah the plate. The blue of Mrs. Carter's eyes was the same blue as the blanket under George's chin, and sometimes Aaliyah thought about how small gestures stacked up to become someone's lifeline. It was not always gentle out there. A few mornings in, a suited man with a briefcase and the smell of aftershave complained to a customer about the unsightly sleeping at the stop. He tapped his phone, eyes flicking with annoyance. The city's polite men had learned to turn a face away from things they found inconvenient. Aaliyah stepped in, shredded proof of a stubbornness that had been bred into her by late nights and too few hours of sleep. "He's not bothering anyone," she said. "He just needs a warm sandwich." The man looked at her like she was a problem to be solved with a policy or a municipal program. "Public spaces have rules," he said. "Then find another rule," Aaliyah said. "One that doesn't require you to scowl at people for being tired." The man flushed and left. George, who had been watching, smiled with the corner of his mouth. He told stories in fragments, the kinds of things that leave more questions than answers. "Helicopters," he'd say, tapping the side of his head with 2 thin fingers. "Missions that don't appear on maps." He'd fold those sentences into quiet jokes and then change the subject. "How do you stay so calm?" Aaliyah asked him one morning when the city had been a rougher shape than usual and she felt like everything might crack. George glanced at the thermos and then at the sandwich. "Some things you can't take with you if you panic," he said. "You hold on steady and you pick the small things that matter." She nodded, tucking the thought into a pocket where it could warm her later. It became part of the ritual. The sandwich, the thermos, the blue blanket, the exchange of small courtesies. Those mornings, behind the rhythm of work and class and the unending math of survival, Aaliyah found an anchor. The anchor was simple and stubborn, to show up. The first block of their habit, this precise world of 6:15 rituals, was the thing that shaped everyone who watched. Stay with the story. It would not always be about a sandwich. It would become, painfully and irrefutably, about how a small, consistent kindness comes up against systems big enough to erase a person. If you want to see how a thermos and a promise become a national reckoning, keep listening. On a rainy Thursday in late October, the math on Aaliyah's kitchen table was particularly sharp. Envelopes lay like little islands: rent, utilities, tuition. The microwave timer ticked down the last minute of a frozen dinner while her phone buzzed with class reminders. She added and subtracted down the page until her head felt like a bell ringing too long. There are kinds of pressure that map themselves onto the ribs. She could feel rent like a weight under her sternum. She could feel hope like a breathing thing under her blouse. She took the cable of her laundry basket and walked to the laundromat. On the way back, she ducked under the bus shelter, where George sat with the blanket over his knees and a face that had a country's worth of weather in it. He handed her a folded photograph, edges soft with handling, and the image faded by time to a sepia that seemed almost deliberate. It was of a younger man in uniform, the chin up, a hint of steel and something private in the eyes. He had given it to her weeks before, saying, "Keep it safe. Don't let it leak into someone's hands if I'm not around." "Why me?" she had asked. "Because you remember the small things," he had said, "and because you understand thermoses." They both laughed at that, but she kept the photograph folded in her pocket like a talisman. She would take it out sometimes when a shift felt like it would swallow her whole, and she would think of the man in the picture and the man in the blanket, and the way ordinary courage looks when it's lived quietly. The incident came with no warning that was useful. It was suddenly an event, and forever an event. One morning as Aaliyah approached with the sandwich lip of wax paper showing under her hand, George sat up and clutched his chest. At first she thought it was cold. Then his face changed from patient to alarmed, and the breath left him in a sound she would replay in her head for months, the collapsing of something that had been holding steady for years. She leaned down. "George?" she said. His eyes were wet, and he tried to focus on her, as if mooring himself with attention. People around them, commuters, the suited man with the briefcase from weeks ago, fanned out with the practiced distance of those who do not know how to help. Aaliyah dropped to the bench, put both hands on his shoulder, and called out for someone to call 911. The paramedics arrived with a calm that seemed like a discipline they'd been trained to perform. They asked questions with clipped efficiency, and Aaliyah answered for George. His name, the street he was found on, the blue blanket, the thermos. In the back of the ambulance, he squeezed her hand with surprising strength for a man who had been felled minutes before. "Promise me," he whispered in a voice that sounded like the rustle of paper. "Promise what?" she asked, though she had a feeling that the most important promises were always the ones you didn't ask to make. They were the ones that found you already making them. He reached slowly into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small envelope. The paper was cheap, the seal broken and resealed so many times it creased like a canyon. He handed it to her with hands that trembled but did not shame. Inside was a packet of old receipts, a dog-eared notebook, and the faded photograph she remembered. "Keep it," he said. "If anything happens, keep it safe. If anyone asks, remember the girl." She thought he meant himself, his life, but the words landed in both places. At the emergency department, the fluorescent lights were too bright, and the world smelled like antiseptic and coffee. Aaliyah watched them take George into triage. The intake clerk asked for identification. There was none. There was a thin, official-shaped form that had been folded in a pocket and had nothing written where a name should be. Paramedics hummed through the room with a practiced motion, placing blankets into corners and pulling aside machines that blinked with red and green patience. It took time for institutions to wobble into their administrative gait. Aaliyah sat in the useless plastic chairs and called Mrs. Carter, who came with a travel mug held like armor. Mrs. Carter put a hand on Aaliyah's shoulder, an allowance for the grief that had not yet had a mouth. Hospital staff moved through their roles. A young intake worker, R. Williams, with a voice that tried to be steady and did its best, pulled up a database and keyed in the few identifiers they had. Approximate age, the color of the blanket, any distinguishing marks. The screen gave them names that didn't fit, and then, like some mechanical cough, it coughed up a match, a name that corresponded to a name in a record. They printed a face and set it beside the machine. It was George's face in the photograph, only sharper, less softened by time. "There's a VA match," R. Williams said, not entirely surprised, but with the awkwardness that comes from encountering a bureaucratic body in the wrong place. "But the records are redacted. Redacted." The word slipped into the air and weighed like a brick. It means something removed, something blacked out, lines of ink like the bars of a prison. It meant that parts of a life were being kept out of sight for reasons that did not make themselves available to Aaliyah and Mrs. Carter, and the paramedics who had gently carried him through the sliding doors. Dr. Patel, who had been monitoring George's heart rate and breathing, spoke softly when she told them, in the way doctors must translate worry into manageable terms. "He'll need monitoring. We'll reach out to the VA to see what we can confirm about his records." "Redacted?" Aaliyah repeated, mouth dry. It felt like a question that might not have a real answer. Later, an administrative nurse with a laminated badge and a voice that came from a person who had installed procedures like shelves called Aaliyah to a private booth. "We found this," she said, placing on the table the small sealed envelope George had given Aaliyah. "He wanted you to have it." Aaliyah swallowed. She had already been holding the memory of the exchange like a brace against the cold. She opened the small packet with fingers that felt both frantic and reverent. In it was the photograph, the notebook, and a note. Only a sentence, a scroll that looked like a voice catching on the page. "If anything happens, find someone who remembers me." That night she sat by the window of a borrowed chair in a hospital family room and read the notebook by the poor light of a vending machine's blue glow. The notebook was not full of accolades or long narratives. It held a handful of dates, scribbled phrases, the kind of shorthand that looks like code to anyone who doesn't know the terms. He had written, "Some things are closed off. Honors never spoken in open rooms. Keep it." There were margins where he had sketched a horizon. There were complaints about coffee, about cold hospital floors. There was a signature at the end, a name that matched the face in the photograph. When the VA finally returned the hospital's call, it was a bureaucratic dance of passcodes and wait times. Aaliyah listened as a calm, formal voice, someone on the other end of a system built to protect secrets and to serve citizens, said, "The file exists, but portions are restricted due to classified components." She thought of the word and how it looked stamped on paper, the black rectangles hiding more than ink ever should. George was transferred to a VA facility that took pride in a different set of rituals. Towels folded like origami, intake forms that smelled like institutional paper, a corridor that glowed with institutional light. The nurses there called him by his name with a kind of relief, as if having a name made the job easier. He improved in small ways, a stronger color, a steadier step between his bed and the window. He joked about the food. He asked Aaliyah about her classes and whether she had taken the microskills exam. "You're going to make a good nurse," he told her once, and it felt like a benediction he hadn't meant to give her. There was also a patience about the place, a calendar for scheduled visits, a lockbox for personal effects, a caseworker with a clipboard whose job it was to make the individual fit a system. That caseworker, R. Williams, was the kind of person who moved papers like a musician moves notes. She called Aaliyah aside one morning and said, "There are complications in verifying his service record. Some entries are sealed beyond our standard release. We need to work through channels." Channels. It was a word that made time slow down. It meant forms multiplied, approvals signed, people who knew the code and the code's hunger to hide. Aaliyah sat in the caseworker's office and ran her thumb over the envelope because that small paper was the closest real thing she had left that tied George to more than a blanket and a bus stop. Weeks passed in the small, clipped rhythm of hospital rounds and class notes. George's voice, when it came, was softer and more reflective. He told her about the photograph's man, not the missions, never the missions, but the man who had loved to talk about the taste of coffee in a desert, or the way the night sky opens when you are somewhere that does not give you a map. He would flash a grin and whisper, "Things I can't tell you properly," then fold his hands as if closing a book. She slept less. The nights her head hit the pillow were full of equations and the not comfortable image of a man in a blue blanket. She thought about all the institutions they had relied on throughout their lives, schools, hospitals, the postal system, and how some of those institutions had a layer that guarded secrets in ways that made people like George invisible at the worst possible moments. The death came in the unwieldy middle of a Tuesday. It was not dramatic in the way movies make death dramatic. It was the gentle quiet that follows the end of a long, exhausting sentence. The nurses had stepped out for a minute. The monitor made soft noises. Aaliyah had been across town, delivering a tray to a ward where the flowers smelled faintly of lemon. Mrs. Carter called her on her break and then sent her a text. Aaliyah rushed back and found a corner of the room empty where George had been sitting. She sat down in the hospital's plastic chair and let something peel out of her like an old coat. They gave her his personal effects in a brown envelope that looked ordinary and therefore monumental. Inside, folded with the same care that George had once used to slice wax paper around peanut butter, lay a letter addressed only to a high-ranking title, Inspector General. At the top of the paper, in handwriting she'd come to recognize as both patient and urgent, was a single line underlined twice. It was a plea and an instruction of equal weight. Remember the girl. She did not open it immediately. She held it to her chest, a small, quiet object heavy with all the responsibilities the man had placed on her in a few brittle gestures. She thought of the thermos, the meetings, the bus stop, the morning where his chest had folded like a book. She thought of Mrs. Carter's apron pockets and the photograph, now creased into a personal canon of things to carry forward. On the day she decided to mail the letter, the sky had been compartmentalized into thin bands of cloud, the weather station on the radio giving an indifferent forecast. Aaliyah walked to the post office and stood in a line with people who had other letters and other obligations, overdue notices, college forms, the kind of mail that felt like a to-do list. The clerk at the counter was tired and distracted, a student worker who misfiled a stamp and then recovered with apologetic hands. "This is for the Inspector General," she said, laying the envelope on the counter. Her fingers were steady. The clerk took it, inspected the official handwriting like she was handling fragile glass, and asked if she wanted tracking. "Yes," Aaliyah said. The clerk slapped a barcoded sticker onto the manila and handed her the receipt. The post office's printers whirred as if that sound might sanctify the act. She kept the receipt in the small pocket of her jacket, the way people keep proof that they have done the right thing. There was no fanfare. There was only the belabored, simple rolling of the world continuing on its axis, and Aaliyah walking back to work with a new weight, less of a burden, more of a responsibility. The envelope was no longer on the table, but the instruction hummed like a live wire in her chest. "Remember the girl," it said. "Remember the small acts that become someone's only record of being seen." In the days that followed, routine resumed its fractal forms. Aaliyah still rose before dawn. She still brought sandwiches. She still got on buses that hissed and coughed as they took her from one uniformed world to another. But the rhythm had changed. Now there was a sense that the small gestures might be the only bridge between an invisible life and a system that had the capacity to honor or to erase. At the VA facility, a veteran's file had been found, and the redactions became a problem that could not be dismissed. R. Williams called Aaliyah to say that someone in the VA had escalated the matter to a higher office. The voice on the other end was careful, like someone holding a live animal that might dart at any moment. "We are initiating an internal inquiry," the person said. "There may be restricted materials." "Restricted how?" Aaliyah asked, trying to flatten the word until she could see inside it. "Some parts of his service were labeled classified, sealed beyond routine disclosure," the voice said. "There will be steps to trace the file. It is procedural." Procedural. Aaliyah had come to know that word as a place where lives could be caught in waiting rooms. But there was an unusual thing that pulled at the edges of procedure: the small sealed letter, the photograph, the man who had asked her to remember. Those human details were inconvenient to the neatness of bureaucracy. Weeks turned to months in a way that made Aaliyah count in new currencies, weeks of hearings planned, of emails sent with subject lines that suggested urgency, follow-up, escalation, records request. There were calls that began with, "This is a courtesy call from," and ended with a sentence that meant little without action. Each ping and ring was like a small bell. The bell tolled for action and also for more waiting. In the interstices, there were small luminous things. Mrs. Carter brought soup. Aaliyah began tutoring a younger student from her nursing program, a woman who had been homeless once and who needed to pass a licensing exam. Aaliyah taught her how to take vitals with a grace that made the younger woman's hands stop shaking. "You learn best when you help someone else," George would have said if he had been there. It was what he had always said in fragments. The fragments made sense now as a philosophy. Help someone else because it teaches you how to hold your own life steady. Aaliyah found herself at night replaying the morning of his collapse, cataloging the feelings like a checklist. She asked over and over again whether she had done enough, whether kindness could ever be the substitute for a system that had obligations with names and forms. She went through the motions of grief like a professional in training, allowing herself a hot minute of rage, a long trawl through memory, a practiced resignation that did not accept resignation as the end but as a port of departure. And then, on an ordinary afternoon when the city hummed with the unremarkable cruelty of weather that was neither kind nor wicked, Mrs. Carter called her with something like urgency in her voice. "They want to talk to you at the VA," she said. "Someone higher up. They said to bring the photograph, your notes, bring anything you have." Aaliyah packed the photograph in a plastic sleeve. She folded the receipt from the post office into her wallet and sat down for a minute with the thermos on her lap. The thermos made the same small click when she shut it that it had on the first morning she began the ritual. She breathed in the smell of coffee and felt the man, his voice, his steady hand, like an orbit she was in. At the VA, they had a room with a long table and chairs that seemed designed to flatten people's silhouettes. A woman in uniform spoke first. Her badge said, "Liaison," and her posture said, "I am authorized." Later, Aaliyah would remember the shape of the room as a kind of mouth that opened professionally and then shut. The liaison said, "We have located additional records, but there are complications. Some entries are sealed at a level that requires executive review." "Who reviews that level?" Aaliyah asked. She could hear the muscles tighten in her own throat. "It escalates to the Inspector General's office when necessary," the liaison said. "If there are national security concerns, they will handle it through the appropriate channels." "Aren't we talking about a man who deserves to be counted?" Mrs. Carter asked, and her voice turned the room towards something that did not have a neat procedural box. "A man who got up at dawn and kept a thermos?" The liaison's face did not change. "We will do our due diligence," she said. It was a sentence that was meant to be conclusive, but it sounded like an opening door to Aaliyah. She found that her hands were not steady. She placed the photograph on the table. It was the kind of image that made people look in a different way, one that asked them to imagine the person in the picture as not just someone who was redacted, invisible, but a life with attachments and dignity. There was a long meeting after that, people with lanyards and titles and a documentation trail that made it feel like an organism. A checkbox here, a signature there. The machinery of the state turned slowly, but with some weight. Aaliyah left the VA that afternoon with a paper trail and a new anxiety that was almost administrative in tone. Would the actions be enough? Would a man who had been erased by redactions be restored to a ledger of honor? The weeks that followed were a slurry of small victories and bureaucratic setbacks. They found some details in his file, decorations that had been documented in the margins, dates that matched his handwriting in the notebook, a medal recorded in a ledger with a punched hole where an officer had clipped something long ago. But there were also blacked out lines that left the narrative of his life with teeth missing. Aaliyah kept bringing sandwiches. She kept tutoring. She kept looking for forms of solidarity that did not require clearance. On the morning she got the phone call that would change the map, she was washing a tray in the cafeteria and had soap up to her wrists. The voice on the other end was brisk and used the kind of language that was efficient because it had been tested in many rooms that mattered. "We tracked down more records," they said. Some of his service was indeed classified. "There are discrepancies in how the file was handled. We need to conduct an internal audit." An internal audit was still a word that belonged to the machinery. It meant the problem was being taken seriously enough to be inspected. It meant people with titles were looking at the problem. It meant, in a small way, that the thermos and the blanket were now visible to a world of men who wore medals and to which people had given power. There was a moment, thin, bright, when the city seemed to tilt on axis. Somebody in a room with a big table looked at the photograph and at the sealed pages and thought, "This is not right." That thought, small and human, would prove to be a hinge. Aaliyah's life did not rearrange overnight. She still had shifts to work, exams to take, and a small ledger of bills. But now there was a sense that what had been a private tenderness might be folding outward into consequence. A photograph in a plastic sleeve had the power to summon an audit. Arthur's word for that morning was momentum, the way a small pebble starts a landslide. There were meetings with people who were not used to being spoken to in plain language. "What did you see?" they asked her in rooms with cameras and with polite stenographers. "What did you notice about his care?" She told the truth. She told them about the thermos, about the blue blanket, about the mannered way he accepted help. She told them that in a city of 10 million people, small rituals like a sandwich at dawn should not be the primary record of someone's life. She told them that names mattered. It was in one of those meetings, after an early morning shift and a wet walk through a street that smelled of diesel and turned leaves, that Aaliyah sat down at a small table with an officer from the VA and a caseworker who had become her intermediary. They placed a file on the table that had a red stamp on it that read, "Redacted." The thick black bars on the page looked like a censor's fist. The feeling in the room turned inward for a second, then it turned outward like a small swell. "This is why I wrote the letter," the liaison said, "because when you see the file, you remember the person." And somewhere between seeing the photograph again and the blacked-out lines on the page, Aaliyah felt as if the city had finally acknowledged that a life had been lived. It was not a triumphant feeling. It was more like the relief when a wound begins to heal. Not healed yet, but acknowledged, bandaged in public rather than left to fester unseen. She left that night with a new list to carry. The audit would take time. The letter she had mailed sat somewhere in a chain of custody. People with lanyards promised action. Aaliyah kept going back to the bus stop because it was where things began. She could no longer pretend that a thermos was only a thermos. It was an emblem of witness. The ritual of giving continued, but with a different quality, a sense that small, steady acts could be a bridge to accountability. She wrapped another sandwich in the same careful way and tucked it into a paper bag. She checked the thermos. The blue blanket lay folded where George had left it. The photograph lay in her coat pocket, in a plastic sleeve like a heart she had learned to carry. That night she wrote in her notebook the way George had written in his, short phrases, a list of errands, a reminder. Keep the receipt, keep the faith. She did not know if faith was the right word. She had enough faith to get out of bed in the morning and to stand in the rain with a sandwich, enough faith to believe that someone looking at a picture and a note could change the course of an institution. There were thunderheads on the horizon as if the weather could sense the tilt. She slept hard and dreamless for a few hours, then woke with the taste of metal in her mouth. In the morning she took the sandwich, wrapped the thermos, and walked to the bus stop with a pocket full of receipts and a heart full of small-edged hope. At the shelter desk, she signed in with her name and a number. A volunteer handed her a hand-drawn flyer that read, "Volunteer needed," and a coffee. She smiled and took it. The city's small kindnesses were often arranged like this, paper and coffee in human hands. The day passed in motions. A tray delivered to a patient who called the nurse sweetie, a lecture on electrolytes, a practice exam for her licensing. Her phone vibrated once with a message from R. Williams. "We have movement on the file." There was a short line of ellipses after the text, as if the person who wrote it did not know how to compress the sense of what they felt. Aaliyah exhaled slowly. Movement. The word felt like a promise that was not yet owed. That afternoon, as the light became the color of old coins, she stopped at the corner store and bought a pen. She wanted to write something in the margin of the photograph, but her hands faltered. She decided instead to fold the photograph into the notebook and put the new pen in her pocket. On the way home, she took the long route past the shelter, past the bench, past the bus stop where George had once tucked his blanket. She did not know yet that the letter would find a desk, that the photograph would live in a file that would be opened again and again by people who did not know the man whose life it represented. She did not know yet that a woman in a cafeteria apron would testify in a room with microphones and cameras months from now. She only knew there was a letter she had mailed, a receipt in her wallet, and a photograph tucked like a promise in her coat. She only knew that she kept giving sandwiches because giving was a form of evidence, a way to show someone that they still existed in a world that often forgot them. That evening, before bed, she took out the photograph and smoothed the plastic sleeve with her thumb. She looked at the face in the picture and whispered, "I'll remember." The words were not performative. They were a binding, a kind of vow that could exist between two people without an audience. She folded the photograph back into the notebook and slid it under her pillow as if that might anchor it to her in the night. She slept with the thermos at the edge of her table like a small closed promise. Outside, a bus hissed and then was gone. The city kept moving. Inside, a life kept stitching itself together, one small act at a time, waiting for the knock that would change everything. The knock came before dawn, as if the city itself knew to be gentle. Aaliyah woke with the photograph under her pillow and the thermos on the nightstand. Her first thought was still the bus stop, the memory of his hand, the way he had said, "Remember the girl." She opened the door to a narrow hallway and two uniforms, one with a steady stare, another with creased sleeves that suggested a long flight. A third man, older and carrying himself like a person who had spent a life translating discipline into patience, stood behind them. They did not look like men who delivered bad news with flourish. They looked like men who had been told something needed to be fixed and had come to ask how. "Miss Cooper?" Colonel Hayes said. He had a voice that had been used to rooms where one sentence carried consequence. "I'm Colonel Hayes. These are Officers Martinez and Carter. We were sent by the liaison at the VA. You found the photograph," Aaliyah interrupted, because she had been practicing interruptions in her head for weeks. The photograph was always an answer and a question at once. Hayes inclined his head. "We found other things too. We need to speak with you about Mr. Fletcher's records." They asked if they could come in. She stepped aside. Mrs. Carter, who had taken to sleeping on a cot in a corner of the hospital's family room for a few nights during the worst of it, had left a note on the kitchen table and a pot of coffee still warm on the stove. The men accepted coffee as if it were another item of official business. They arranged themselves at the small kitchen table as if it were a briefing room. Hayes was careful. He avoided the temptation to make the story cinematic. "Some of the entries are classified," he said. "That means access requires review by higher authorities. It doesn't mean there is nothing to be done. There are honors in his record, and there are gaps we intend to trace." Aaliyah watched their faces for the human shape beneath the uniforms. Martinez, who kept adjusting the strap of his bag, looked younger than the others, and looked like someone who still kept the habit of being surprised at how often paperwork changed a life. "Why come to me?" Aaliyah asked. She had the letter tucked in her wallet, the receipt from the post office, the thin record of her decision to mail a single envelope. She thought they came because someone had seen that she had done the simple, stubborn thing, because someone had taken the time to remember. Hayes did not answer exactly. He reached into his jacket and produced a business card with an emblem she recognized from 1,000,000 movies and 100 solemn news segments, an emblem that now felt shockingly real. "General Victoria Ashford asked we follow up. She wanted to know who the girl in the letter was." The name landed like a tide. Aaliyah had seen General Ashford's picture in briefings. A sharp jaw, a stern look softened by lines that suggested both experience and curiosity. She had not expected the person at the top to be the one chasing an envelope in the first place. Military hierarchies tended to look downward for explanations. What she could not tell was whether she would find a face that could translate bureaucracy into action. They did not ask for much. They wanted context, the small facts. Times, the cadence of George's mornings, what he carried, the way he talked about missions that don't appear on maps. They listened to her the way people listen when they know they have a limited time to keep something alive. Aaliyah told them about the thermos, about the blue blanket, about the photograph and the envelope. She told them about the day he had clutched his chest and the way the medical team had arrived like a practiced kindness. At the end of the conversation, Hayes looked at her squarely. "Would you be willing to come to the Pentagon? General Ashford is assembling a small team to review the handling of classified veterans' records. She would like your account." It was startling, the way a single sentence can render the ordinary into a corridor that leads someplace no one had expected. Aaliyah thought of her shifts, her tuition, the notebook where she kept her class reminders. She thought of the thermos. She thought of the envelope in the postmarked pile somewhere between her keys and the receipts. She had not expected an envelope to send patrols up the chain of command. She had expected it to be an instruction between her and an absent man. "Yes," she said. It felt like the wrong-sized word for a thing that might change everything, but it was honest. Yes, she would go. The Pentagon is both larger and smaller inside than people think. It is full of rooms where paper is moved with the deliberation of choreography, and of offices where decisions hinge on a quiet insistence. General Ashford received Aaliyah in an office that looked out over a courtyard ringed with flags. The general was not all stern jaw and medals. She moved with an economy of gestures that suggested someone who knew the weight of words. "You mailed a letter," Ashford said without preamble. "You asked someone to remember a girl. You did something small and it landed in the right place." Aaliyah felt suddenly that being small in that room was not a disadvantage. She told Ashford the story. The thermos, the mornings, the collapse, the envelope, the note. She described George in the sparing language of someone who had loved another person's small shapes. Ashford listened, and when she spoke, it was with a voice that could make policy sound like moral responsibility. "We found gaps in his file," Ashford said. "Some entries were sealed, yes. There appears to have been a failure in how the VA flagged and tracked certain classified records. That failure rendered a decorated veteran invisible at the time he needed aid." Aaliyah thought of the word failure the way you think of a leak. It starts small, unnoticed, until it is pouring. The general described the audit she had ordered: internal teams to trace file movements, a task force to recommend administrative reforms for tracking classified records, and a public reckoning that would include testimony before Congress. Ashford's sentences had the clean lines of someone who had rehearsed accountability until it sounded like common sense. "Would you be willing to testify?" she asked, "not as a spectacle but as a witness." There was a map of rooms and microphones in the general's office, but also something that looked like human acknowledgement. Aaliyah remembered George's hand in the ambulance, the way he had whispered, "Promise me." The promise had been to the man, but it had become a summons to a system that had the power to remember more people. She nodded. Over the next weeks, the momentum that had been slow took on a new velocity. People at the VA who had been polite moved from passive concern into action. The Inspector General's office opened an inquiry. Ashford convened a task force that included both military officers and VA officials. Meetings proliferated, rooms with legal counsel who spoke in measured tones, auditors with laptops that stored redacted pages, staffers who printed fewer words and circled them in black pen. Aaliyah learned that institutions have languages, protocols, and forms of grief that look a lot like bureaucracy. There were meetings designed to teach her how to testify. An aide from the general advised her on logistics and offered to arrange for a travel allowance and a small stipend for time off. A team at the Capitol called and asked whether she would sit in a briefing with senators and staffers to prepare for the hearing. She was asked politely if she wanted a press coach. There was a temptation to make herself auditorium ready, to think of sound bites and neat lines. That temptation felt wrong to her in a way that surprised her. The sandwich had not been a soundbite. The thermos had not been a slogan. She told the people who offered to put her in a class on media speaking that she did not want to rehearse away the edges of what she felt. "I just want to tell the truth," she said. Someone scribbled this on a notepad. It made it onto a roster as authentic testimony. There was a phrase on someone's laptop that categorized her as witness civilian. Preparations for the hearing were a study in tension between performance and reality. Media teams debated framing. A senator's aide practiced the cadence of asking a question in a way that suggested it would be both searching and headline-ready. General Ashford's staff drafted statements that balanced institutional humility with concrete commitments. There was a legal team that read and reread the redacted pages to see what language would be safe to disclose and what would remain classified. Aaliyah sat in rooms that smelled of strong coffee and paper, and tried to keep the photograph in her pocket like an anchor. The morning of the hearing, the hall where the Senate Armed Services Committee met was cavernous with a decorous gravity. Cameras were kept at a regulated distance. There were rows of people in suits whose jackets seemed to have a weight stitched into them. Aaliyah walked in with Mrs. Carter at her side and R. Williams from the VA tucked into a seat behind her. The photograph was in her pocket in a plastic sleeve. The envelope's receipt was folded in the same habit she had used for years to keep bills from folding into despair. The blue blanket, she realized with a small shock, had been installed at the VA facility in a place where veterans could sit with it on certain mornings as a kind of memorial, an improvisation that had begun with a nurse who liked small rituals. Senators Drummond and Gaines were the ones who called the hearing into session. Both wore the careful civility of public servants who had spent years in rooms of argument and compromise. Drummond's voice had the measured warmth of someone who had spent a life explaining complicated things in simple terms. Gaines's approach was more businesslike. He kept his answers tight. Aaliyah was the third witness to speak. Before her, a VA official laid out in bureaucratic language the steps that had been taken to audit the file, to locate additional documentation, and to begin an internal review. General Ashford then spoke, not as a general about strategy, but as someone who had followed a human thread back to a human consequence. She described the audit, the initial findings, and an initiative she proposed, a fund in George Fletcher's name to provide immediate aid to veterans whose records had been mishandled, administrative reforms to better flag classified files, and an internal task force to recommend systemic fixes. When samplers asked for the civilian witness, Aaliyah walked to the microphone. She felt her own pulse in a way that made the room smaller and her voice larger. There were cameras, there were lights, there were people she had only met on the run in corridors. But when she looked at the senators, she thought of the bus stop and saw the man in the blanket, remembered the way he had smiled when she said, "I need you." She thought of the envelope with its shaky instruction. She thought of Ashford's steady hand. The thought that rose in her chest was elemental. This was not about politics, it was about counting people. She did not prepare a speech. She spoke in the way she had practiced in small rooms. Plainly, with particular detail, the thermos and the peanut butter, the blue blanket, the photograph. She told them about the morning George had clutched his chest and the ambulance arriving like a kindness. She told them about the redacted pages, the word classified, and what that had meant for a man who was now gone. She said simply, he needed someone to remember that he was here. There was a microphone that recorded every syllable. Her voice shook once, and then she steadied it. She used short sentences when she reached the parts that hurt most. It wasn't that he wanted medals, she said. He wanted to be counted. He wanted his life to matter. A moment of silence followed, like the space between strikes of a bell. Then the senators began their questions. They were careful, sometimes blunt, searching for both facts and for a moral compass. Drummond asked about the sufficiency of VA tracking systems. Gaines asked about interagency communication when files are flagged as classified. General Ashford answered with candor and a willingness to accept responsibility. There were people in the room who had written memos and had been practiced in how to avoid being undone by questions. The combination of Ashford's admission of gaps and Aaliyah's simple testimony created a pressure that felt like honest work. At one point, a reporter asked whether the hearing signaled broader problems in how institutions treat veterans with classified service. Ashford replied that the problem was not simply bureaucracy, but a moral failure. Procedures are only as good as the care with which people apply them. There was a sentence that would later be quoted in newspapers. Small acts need systems to hold them up, she said. Newspapers later made this into headlines in varying tones, some more rhetorical than Aaliyah would have liked. But in the room, the phrase was an attempt to name the moral logic of the moment. Two things came out of the hearing that had immediate traction. First, a bipartisan group announced the creation of the George Fletcher Memorial Fund, with seed money allocated for emergency grants to veterans who found themselves without access to benefits because of record-keeping failures. Second, Senator Drummond introduced, with almost immediate grassroots support, a legislative proposal drafted in consultation with Ashford's task force and VA officials to strengthen tracking of classified records so that veterans whose service was limited by security requirements would nevertheless have reliable points of contact for benefits and outreach. Colloquially, it became known as the Fletcher Act in the days after the hearing, though the language of the law would take time and many hands. The press coverage split the story into tidy segments. Some outlets wanted a narrative of the photograph that went from bus stop to the corridors of power. Others wanted to reduce it to a procedural debate about redactions. Aaliyah paid little attention to the headlines. The things she noticed were smaller. A phone call from a woman in a shelter who had seen the hearing and wanted to know how to get help for her boyfriend who had been without records for years. An email from a nurse who worked nights who wrote simply, "I remember the thermos." The fund's initial grants reached clinics and outreach groups within weeks, providing emergency housing vouchers and transportation to VA facilities for veterans who had been invisible for too long. At home, the photograph in the sleeve seemed to weigh more than it had in the Pentagon. The thermos clicked shut in the early morning as if in affirmation. Aaliyah kept working, shifts, classes, tutoring, and took meetings with the Ashford Task Force. She surprised herself by being useful in those rooms. She could translate lived experience into practical needs. Mobile outreach, clear phone lines for veterans, better signage at VA intake points, instructing staff on how to escalate when files are flagged as classified, but benefits are needed. She argued for small things, because she had learned that small things often do the real work. There were occasional setbacks. Legal counsel reminded everyone that classification existed for reasons and that reforms had to respect legitimate security concerns. Some staffers worried that the publicity would lead to more secrecy. Aaliyah learned to sit through these debates without the romantic expectation that all meetings will end in rushing applause. Ashford's leadership mattered because she insisted on both caution and forward motion, a transparent audit and tangible help for affected veterans. That insistence created a pattern of action. The Fletcher Fund's grant committee, which included veterans advocates, VA officials, and a representative for families of service members, began meeting weekly. There were necessary rubrics, eligibility criteria, quick turnaround disbursement mechanisms, partnerships with shelters, and community health centers. In one meeting, a social worker told a story of a man who had been denied a modest housing voucher because his file did not appear in VA databases the way it should have. The table went quiet. The problem was so ordinary that it felt like a betrayal. It pressed the group to prioritize immediate cash assistance for those cases where bureaucracy and poverty had collided. Aaliyah was invited to join a community liaison role in a pilot program funded by the Memorial Fund. Her title was modest. Her impact was practical. She interviewed veterans who had difficulty accessing benefits because records were delayed or redacted. She made home visits, carried thermoses of coffee as much out of habit as charity, and taught small groups how to navigate intake forms. The work was messy and satisfying. She learned names that did not make it into media profiles. Those names became important because policy eventually needs stories that create empathy. One morning, she walked into a trailer-sized meeting room at a vet center to meet a young woman named Sarah. Sarah had served in a support role overseas and had returned with a knot of fatigue and a leash she couldn't meet. She had missed a couple of appointments because she had been moved from shelter to shelter. Aaliyah sat with her, made coffee in paper cups, and listened. She helped Sarah pull together discharge paperwork and reach out to a caseworker. A week later, Sarah sent a text. "Got a bed. Got an appointment. Thank you." The ripple of a morning sandwich had grown, slowly, into a network of responsive squares. Not all ripples were linear. There were families who mistrusted institutions, veterans who had been failed by more than paperwork. There were bureaucratic obstacles that required acts of persistence on the part of staff who were not famous and did not go on camera. The Fletcher Fund's early grants were life-saving in some cases and symbolic in others. The law the senators introduced moved through committees with edits and hearings and partisan wrestling that, Aaliyah observed, often obscured the human reasons for the work. But in the rooms where grants were issued and where outreach workers folded brochures into their packs, the changes meant fewer nights sleeping on the floor of emergency rooms, fewer missed appointments because of transportation costs. Months later, there was a memorial at Arlington. It was not the public pageant the newspapers suggested. It was small and intimate, attended by a handful of veterans, Mrs. Carter, R. Williams, Colonel Hayes, and a modest delegation from Ashford's office. The headstone, if it could be called that in the conventional sense, bore George's name and dates. Someone from the VA read a quiet eulogy that emphasized service and dignity. Aaliyah stood at the front and placed a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper on a small stone ledge by the grave. It felt irreverent and tender at once. The sandwich, the thermos set down like an offering. Sometimes the ordinary things are what hold us, Mrs. Carter said to Aaliyah afterward, and the phrase felt true in ways that were hard to measure. As policy and ceremonies moved forward, Aaliyah returned to the rhythms that had grounded her. She did night shifts, she graded class notes, she taught a new student how to take blood pressure. The work with the Memorial Fund and the outreach program became part of her life, a thread woven in with the other obligations. She found herself less surprised by how many people needed a hand and more surprised by the dignity each person carried. Years later, time measured by shifts and semesters rather than by calendar columns, the VA reported improved tracking mechanisms for classified service members. The Fletcher Act, after amendments and bipartisan negotiations, passed with provisions that set up a liaison system specifically for veterans whose records involved classified components. The law did not erase all pain, but it created pathways for assistance and for accountability when things went wrong. It created a centralized point of contact and allocated funds for outreach. Those were technical things, but they were also literal bridges. The George Fletcher Memorial Fund disbursed thousands of small grants in its first 2 years. Some paid for rent for a veteran who would otherwise have slept on a hospital floor. Others paid for transportation to counseling. The fund made it possible for outreach workers to find men and women who had slipped between systems and to give them a name on the ledger of care. The ripple from Aaliyah's sandwich now included an army of social workers, nurses and volunteers who used the thermos as a symbol when they taught a class about small acts of care. Aaliyah's role at the outreach program grew. She mentored Sarah, who later became a coordinator for veteran transition services at a community college. She trained other volunteers how to pack a bag for an appointment, how to keep a phone line open to someone who has lost it, how to keep the photograph in a file when a veteran asked them to remember. The outreach office wallpapered a bulletin board with photographs of small things that mattered: a dented thermos, a blue blanket, a pair of worn shoes. They were not props for a museum, they were reminders. They were practical implementations that required negotiation. How to mark a file without breaking security protocols, ways to alert a caseworker when certain keywords appeared in a file, and how to provide emergency assistance even when a full audit of a record could not be completed immediately. The solutions were incremental, boring in some ways, and life-changing in others. They involved phone trees, shared databases with redaction flags, and a simple phone number veterans could call to reach someone who understood classified records reality. Aaliyah completed her nursing degree in the meantime. She walked across a stage with a chipped mug of coffee in her hand and Mrs. Carter in the crowd cheering like a proud mother. Her first job after receiving her license was in community health at a clinic funded in part by the Memorial Fund. There she met veterans whose names were now on lists that meant something. She taught a class on patient advocacy and used the photograph as a starting point. "This isn't just about paperwork," she'd say. "It's about people who deserve to be seen." One afternoon, she visited a man named Roy who had been sleeping in a bus depot and who had been helped by the fund to get into a short-term housing program. Roy talked about the scalding coffee at the shelter and the small human courtesy of a staffer who sat with him for an hour. They talked about dignity. Roy held her hand and said, "You remember me?" Aaliyah squeezed his hand in return and thought of the thermos. There were moments when the work was maddeningly slow. There were congressional amendments that delayed parts of the law, and there were pockets of bureaucracy that resisted change. But the combination of legal reform, a memorial fund, and a network of community liaisons produced real relief for many. The audit found procedural errors and lapses in how some files had been routed. People were disciplined where necessary. Procedures were changed. The changes did not fix all injustices, but they created a system that, for many veterans, reduced the risk that their service would vanish into redaction. The final public reckoning had never been Aaliyah's goal. She wanted a man to be counted. But the ripple had effects beyond that single desire. It turned the photograph into evidence and the thermos into a symbol. It taught officials something they seemed to have forgotten, that the architecture of a system without human anchors allows people to fall away. In quieter moments, she would go back to the bus stop and sit for a while. Sometimes she would bring a sandwich and leave it on the bench for someone else. Sometimes she just stood and watched the first bus roll by and thought about continuity, how something as small as a sandwich can keep the memory of a person alive in a way a ledger cannot always do. A friend from the outreach program once asked why she kept making the sandwiches even after the fund existed and the law had passed. "Because someone needs to know they're seen," she said. The friend thought it was a moral answer. Aaliyah thought it was practical. Years later, on the anniversary of George's death, Aaliyah walked to Arlington with a small circle of people who had been part of the story. Mrs. Carter, R. Williams, Colonel Hayes, Sarah, and a handful of veterans who had been helped by the fund. They stood before a simple marker and left small tokens: a coin, a worn glove, a sandwich in wax paper placed gently on the stone. An officer from Ashford's staff read a line about service and the weight of memory. There was no grand parade, no trumpet fanfare. There was a quiet that felt like completion. On the bus that day, Aaliyah did what she had done for years. She wrapped a sandwich and checked the thermos. She felt a kind of fullness that was not the same as the relief she had once had. It was older, and it included the ache of memory. The city still had its sharp corners. The homeless still lined certain streets. Poverty still shaped many lives. But in small and concrete ways, a system that once swallowed whispers of service had learned to listen. At the outreach office, there was a new practice manual with a page devoted to remembering gestures, a list of tangible acts volunteers could perform to validate a veteran's life while bureaucratic processes did their slow work. The manual was practical. It asked volunteers to bring water, to offer a seat, to make a record of names and nicknames. It suggested that small acts could be the bridge between an individual and an institution. Aaliyah looked at the page and thought of George's notebook with its shorthand and horizons drawn in the margins. She thought of the line he had underlined twice. She thought of how the small things, thermos clicks, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a photograph kept in a pocket, had connected a solitary life to a nation capable of better. She did not expect gratitude. She expected to keep working. She expected to keep learning. But sometimes, when the city settled around her, and the thermos made its familiar click on the table, she allowed herself to feel the strange fact that a single morning ritual had become something that mattered on a larger scale. One night, after a long day of patient visits and a short lecture she gave on advocacy, she sat on her stoop and took the photograph from her pocket. The edges had softened with handling. She smoothed it like a person smoothing a forehead. She had a small stack of thank you notes from veterans pinned above her desk. She had a curriculum for a new volunteer class. She had a file with the early minutes of the fund's meetings. Those were practical things. The photograph was something else, a promise kept. She whispered to it as if the man might hear. "I remembered." The wind carried the city sounds, exhaust, distant laughter, a radio playing someone's favorite song. She folded the photograph and put it back into the notebook, which she slid under her pillow out of habit and not superstition. The thermos on the table clicked when she closed it. At the bus stop, a plaque was later hung near the bench where George had slept for so many mornings. The plaque didn't claim to sum up a life or a policy. It read simply, "A life remembered." People paused to read it, to take selfies, to leave small tokens. For some it was a curiosity, for others it was a quiet instruction. Aaliyah kept bringing sandwiches, not as a stunt or as a permanent substitute for systemic support, but as a ritual that affirmed what the law had tried to secure, that people should not vanish simply because part of their lives were sealed. She taught volunteers to do the same. No judgment, no pity, just presence. The thermos, she told them, was not about heat. It was about constancy. When the Outreach Center marked the 5-year milestone of the Fletcher Fund, they invited a few speakers. Senator Drummond attended. General Ashford sent a note. Sarah spoke, hands steady. Aaliyah did not prepare a speech. She told the assembled crowd about small things. The click of a thermos lid, the way someone can look at a photograph and see a whole life. She spoke about bureaucracy and tenderness in the same breath because she had learned they were not opposites. After the event, in the corridor where people dissipated into taxis in the city, a young man approached her. His eyes were the kind that knew how to be careful. He said quietly, "I saw you on TV. I didn't know anyone could help me. I slept in a bus depot. I have a box of papers in my mom's attic. I don't know what to do." Aaliyah reached for the thermos she carried out of habit and snapped the lid. The act was unconscious and immediate. She put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Come in on Monday. We'll go through what you have together." It was practical. It was small. There was a truth that had been hard to name at the beginning. Generosity does not cancel fate. A sandwich does not rewrite a life. But generosity can cause fate to notice. Aaliyah had begun with a small ritual in a thermos. Fate, in the form of redaction and neglect, had collided with that ritual and revealed a failing that required repair. The repair was never perfect. The reforms were imperfect and partial. People still fell through cracks. But the ritual had made a noise the system could no longer ignore. On the last morning she wrote about in public remarks years later, she walked to the old bus stop at dawn. The city was still finding its feet. A new generation of volunteers sat under the shelter with thermoses and sandwiches in paper bags. Aaliyah handed a sandwich to a man who smiled in a way she recognized from the first days. She tugged the blue blanket around the man's shoulders and watched him take the thermos and blow on it, a practiced courtesy. She did not make a speech. She did not need to. The plaque nearby caught the new light of morning and glinted like an unremarkable thing of consequence. She thought of all the rooms she had been in since the envelope: Pentagon offices, congressional hearing rooms, clinic meeting rooms, friends' living rooms, the memorial at Arlington. She thought of every small conversation she had had with veterans who had been helped and those who had not been helped yet. The city breathed around her. A bus hissed, doors opened, a baby cried somewhere nearby. She folded the empty wax paper and slipped it into her pocket. The thermos clicked when she set it down. It was an ordinary sound in an extraordinary line of consequence. When she left, a volunteer who had been with her since the first year said, "You changed the system." "Only a little," Aaliyah answered. "Enough for now." She walked away with the photograph in her pocket, a small folded proof of one life, and with receipts tucked into her wallet like markers of a life that had learned to keep track of the small things. She had no illusions about ending suffering. She had learned that memory could be an activist act, and that a sandwich could be both a kindness and a record. As she crossed the street, she looked back at the bus stop one last time before the sky filled with the ordinary rush of morning. The plaque read on, "A life remembered." She thought of George's hand in hers, the quiet insistence that became a chain of responses. She thought of the letter and its single sentence underlined twice. "Remember the girl." Aaliyah smiled because she had kept the promise in the only way she'd known how, by remembering, by continuing to show up, and by making sure systems answered to human needs. She carried the thermos like a silent witness. Her life had been changed by giving, and the nation had been nudged, slowly but undeniably, toward accounting for the ones it had overlooked. If this story leaves you thinking that small acts can't matter, remember the thermos. If it leaves you wondering what to do next, find a way to show up. Donate time, vote for accountability, call a local veterans outreach and ask how you can help. Small, steady things pile up into something that looks a lot like hope. If this reached you and you want to support veteran services or volunteer, consider finding a local shelter or outreach program in your area. And if this story moved you, think about one small action you can take today. Bring a sandwich, make a call, offer a moment of presence. Subscribe for more stories like this and share one act you'll do in the comments.